On the evening of September 10th, 2009, inside a television studio in Sofia, Bulgaria, 6 numbered balls settled one by one into a transparent display tray under the steady warmth of studio lights. The first ball arrived and held its place, then the second. The studio was orderly and lit, the way television studios are, the kind of room built around the premise that nothing unusual will happen, and that if it does, no one will show it on their face. The announcer's voice moved through the numbers in the same measured register it always used, because the voice had no reason to change. The 6 numbers were 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, and 42. 4 days earlier, on September 6th, the Bulgarian National Lottery had drawn those identical numbers, the same 6, in the same lottery, from the same pool of possibilities. The balls had come to rest in their tray on September 6th with the specific configuration of 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, and 42, and now, on September 10th, in a room full of cameras and lighting equipment, and a studio audience watching the familiar theater of the weekly draw, those numbers had appeared again. The announcer finished reading them aloud. The draw was over. The numbers sat in their tray. What followed was not panic, though it briefly looked like it might become something more agitated than that. The Bulgarian government opened an investigation. News organizations in several countries picked up the story. People who had purchased tickets for the September 10th draw found themselves in the strange position of holding a winning combination that had already been won, which meant that the prize pool for that draw was shared among an unusually large number of winners, because a significant number of players, on seeing the September 6th results, had chosen to play the same numbers again in the next draw, reasoning from a kind of mirror logic that a pattern had appeared and might as well be followed. The investigation ran its course. No evidence of tampering was found. No mechanical irregularity was identified. The draw machinery was examined and cleared. The process was reviewed from multiple angles, and when the review was finished, the conclusion was that the Bulgarian National Lottery had, on September 10th, 2009, drawn the same 6 numbers it had drawn 4 days before, and that this had happened the way very rare things happen, because the pool of possibilities is finite and the draws continue. The numbers 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, and 42 went back into the general population of possible outcomes. The investigation closed. The story was reported and then slowly filed away. In the state of North Carolina, in the summer of 2011, a different lottery was running its regular cycle of draws. The North Carolina Education Lottery operated a game called Cash 5, in which 5 numbers were drawn from a set of 43, and the results were published and archived in the systematic way that lottery records are kept, rows of numbers in a table, each draw dated, the whole record, orderly and legible and unremarkable in the way that administrative archives tend to be unremarkable, until something in them requires a second look. On July 9th, 2011, the Cash 5 draw produced the numbers 21, 27, 35, 39, and 41. On July 11th, 2011, the Cash 5 draw produced the numbers 21, 27, 35, 39, and 41. 48 hours separated those 2 draws, and the 5 numbers on each line were identical. An auditor examining the printed record would have needed only a few seconds to see it. 2 rows in a table, each carrying the same 5 numbers, the gap between them a space of exactly 2 days. The North Carolina Education Lottery commissioned an independent audit. Investigators examined the draw equipment and the random number generation process that governed the Cash 5 game, reviewed the records of both draws, and assessed whether any mechanical or procedural irregularity had produced or could have produced the repetition. The audit cleared the equipment. It cleared the process. The investigators found that the draw on July 11th had been conducted under the same conditions as every other Cash 5 draw, and that the 5 numbers it produced happened to be the 5 numbers the game had produced 48 hours before. The printed record, with its 2 identical rows of 5 numbers, was filed. The audit report was filed beside it. The Cash 5 game continued its regular schedule of draws. There is something particular about the image of that printed record. 2 columns of numbers sitting side by side in a table, the repetition visible at a glance, without any special analysis required. The coincidence entirely legible in the simplest possible format. An auditor lifting that page would have felt for a moment the mild displacement of seeing something that looks wrong before understanding begins to catch up. Not alarming, not urgent, just the brief gap between what the eye reports and what the mind has yet to process. The gap closes quickly, as it tends to do. The mind catches up. The page goes into the file. In Israel, the state lottery is administered by Mafal Hapayas, and its draws are broadcast on live television, which means that what happened in October 2010 was witnessed by a viewing audience in real time, and then almost immediately by a much larger audience online. On September 21st, 2010, the Mafal Hapayas lottery drew a specific 6-number combination. The draw was broadcast. The numbers were recorded, the results were published, and distributed in the normal way. On October 16, 2010, less than a month later, the same lottery broadcast another live draw. A technician in a broadcast control room, watching the October 16th draw unfold on a monitor, had access to the September 21st record. The 2 lines of 6 numbers, the one on the monitor and the one on the page, were identical. The broadcast continued to its conclusion. The draw had been conducted on live television, which meant that the repetition was visible to anyone who had kept a record of the September draw, and in the weeks that followed, the clip of the October 16th draw circulated widely online alongside the September 21st results, the 2 sets of numbers placed in parallel for comparison, the match unambiguous. Lottery authorities issued a formal public statement. The draw was reviewed. No irregularity in the draw process was identified, and the statement attributed the repetition to the mathematics of probability, operating across a large number of draws over an extended period. The story moved through news cycles and online discussion, gathered some heat, and then settled. The Mafal Hapayas lottery continued. The broadcast control room continued to receive the feeds of subsequent draws, each one different from what had come before. The October 16th anomaly receding into the archive alongside everything else. What is interesting about the Israeli case is partly the medium live television and partly the timing. Less than 4 weeks separated the 2 draws. That gap is narrow enough that it feels counterintuitive in a way that a longer gap might not. A repetition discovered when comparing draws from a decade apart carries a different quality than a repetition where the identical numbers appeared before most viewers had finished discussing what the first draw meant. The intuitive sense that something deliberate must be at work scales up when the gap between events is short. The intuitive sense, it turns out, is not a reliable instrument for this kind of calculation. Lottery authorities and probability theorists made this point repeatedly in the coverage that followed, and the formal review of the draw supported it. The numbers remained in the record. The formal statement remained in the archive. The October draw was not amended or revised. European lottery regulation has its own archive, and it is a large one. Over the past 3 decades, gaming regulators in Germany, the Czech Republic, and Poland have each documented incidents of near repeat and exact repeat number combinations in national lottery draws. These incidents have been reviewed by the Deutscher Lotto und Totoblock, the coordinating body for the German state lotteries, and each review produced the same kind of outcome: updated ball certification protocols, additional machine servicing requirements, and the filing of a formal report that joined the growing collection of similar reports on the shelves of regulatory offices across the continent. The German Regulatory Archive, if one were to visit it, would present as a quiet room. Shelves of binders hold decades of draw records. Each flagged incident, a near repeat, a confirmed exact repeat, a draw that required additional review, is marked with a small adhesive tab at the edge of the page, the kind of physical marker that archivists use when a document may need to be retrieved. The room would smell faintly of old paper, the way any room does where documents have accumulated for decades. It would be orderly. It would be still. The binders would stand in their rows with their labeled spines facing outward, the record of an activity that has been conducted weekly across multiple countries for as long as anyone in those regulatory offices can remember. Each flag tab marks a moment when the numbers came up in a way that required attention. Most of those moments resolved the way the Bulgarian investigation resolved, and the North Carolina audit resolved, and the Israeli review resolved, with the conclusion that the draw equipment had performed as it was designed to perform, and that the numbers had appeared in the sequence they happened to appear in. The tab remains in the binder. The binder remains on the shelf. The shelf continues to receive new binders as years pass and draws accumulate. What the tab marks is not an error. It marks the record of attention paid, which is a different thing. The purpose of maintaining an archive like this one is not to document failures, but to document the full range of what has occurred, so that when something occurs again, and in a system conducting draws weekly across multiple countries over multiple decades, repetitions of various kinds will occur again. The response does not have to be invented from scratch. The tab says that this has been seen before. The binder holds the record of what was done about it. Ball certification and machine servicing protocols were updated across multiple European lotteries following these reviews. Not because the repeat draws suggested fraud, they did not, but because the reviews offered opportunities to examine draw systems in detail and to identify improvements to the physical standards governing equipment. The precision applied to lottery balls and draw machinery increased over those decades, not as a response to malfunction, but as a response to scrutiny, which is how institutional precision often develops. The scrutiny arrives, the record is examined, the standard is refined. In the regulatory archives, the binders hold this history in a form that is entirely readable by anyone who takes the time to open them. The tabs mark the moments of heightened attention. The reports inside the marked pages describe what was found. What was found, consistently, was that the draws had been conducted correctly. The research that may put all of this most clearly in context came out of a university office in Vancouver in 2010, when statisticians at the University of British Columbia published an analysis of global lottery draw data. The analysis began from a simple observation that at any given point in the early 21st century, hundreds of lottery draws were occurring every week around the world. This is not a round number or an approximation. It is a count of actual draws in actual rooms in actual countries, each one producing a set of numbers that is entered into a record and archived. Dozens of countries operate national lottery programs. Within those programs, multiple games run simultaneously. Each game draws multiple times per week. The cumulative volume of draw events when the global portfolio of active lottery games is considered in its totality is very large, large enough that the researchers at the University of British Columbia concluded, in their 2010 analysis, that the probability of at least one exact repeat draw occurring somewhere in the world within any given decade rises to a statistically meaningful level. Statistically meaningful, in this context, means something close to expected rather than something close to exceptional. When enough draws are conducted with enough frequency across enough games, the question of whether a repeat draw will happen somewhere shifts from a question about probability to a question about timing. The analysis did not conclude that repeat draws are common or that they should be expected in any individual lottery. It concluded that they should be expected somewhere, eventually, given the scale of the global draw calendar. The researcher doing this work would have been sitting at a desk in Vancouver with a database of global lottery draws on the screen, columns of numbers extending down the page, draw after draw, from lottery after lottery, the cursor moving slowly through the rows while a calculation ran in a second window. The calculation would have been converging on a result. The result, when it arrived, would have been smaller than most people would expect. The probability figure, the one representing the threshold at which repetition becomes more likely than not, placed well within the time frame of a normal operational history for a national lottery. That result does not make any individual draw less surprising. When an announcer reads a set of 6 numbers on a Tuesday evening, and those 6 numbers are identical to the 6 numbers drawn the previous Friday, the moment is still worth a pause. The pause is appropriate. The mild displacement is real. What the calculation does is give the pause a context, a frame in which the displacement can find its place without becoming something larger than the moment requires. The Bulgarian studio, on the evening of September 10th, 2009, was one moment in a global calendar of draws happening simultaneously across dozens of countries. While the Bulgarian National Lottery was drawing 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, and 42 for the second time in 4 days, other lotteries were running their own draws in other rooms, under other sets of studio lights, producing other sets of numbers, each of which would be recorded and filed. The Bulgarian result was the one that drew attention, because the Bulgarian result was the one where the numbers matched. The other results in those other rooms proceeded and were archived and were not noted as remarkable because they did not match any previous result. On a different week, in a different country, the match would have fallen somewhere else. The draw that attracted attention would have been a different draw, and the investigation that followed would have reviewed different equipment in a different building and reached the same kind of conclusion. The cumulative total of draws happening week after week, year after year, across the full global calendar of active lottery games adds up to a number large enough to make repetition not an anomaly to be explained, but a feature of the system to be expected. Not frequently, not predictably, not in any identifiable location or game, but somewhere, at some point, with the quiet patience of an outcome that probability has always said would eventually arrive. The 6 numbers settled in their tray in Sofia. The investigation opened and closed. The 5 numbers in North Carolina printed themselves across 2 rows in the same column of the same table, 48 hours apart, and an auditor looked at them and understood what the table was showing. A broadcast control room in Israel received the October 16th feed on its monitor, and a technician set it beside the September 21st record, the 2 lines of numbers sitting identically on the page, the moment documented and filed. A regulatory archive in Germany held its binders on its shelves, each flag tab marking a moment of careful attention that had found nothing more alarming than a draw proceeding correctly through the full range of its possibilities. The lottery draws continue. They continue every week in dozens of countries, in rooms that are lit and monitored and attended by certified technicians and auditors, producing numbers that are recorded and archived in tables that extend back through years and decades of weekly results. The full record of all those draws, laid end to end, represents an enormous quantity of trials, an accumulated weight of random events that the University of British Columbia researchers measured and found to be large enough to change the way the word coincidence ought to be used. Somewhere in that record, occasionally, two rows match. The match is noticed, it is reviewed. It is found to be what the mathematics always said it would eventually be, one of the possible configurations of a finite set, arrived at twice in the long course of a system, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The file is closed. The record continues. The draws go on occurring in their rooms, week after week, each one a small mechanical event in a building somewhere on the global map of operating lotteries, each one adding itself to the cumulative total from which the UBC researchers drew their conclusion that across long enough stretches of time, randomness does not produce endless variety. It produces, alongside the variety, the occasional repetition, not as an error, not as a violation of how random systems work, but as a natural expression of how they work across the scale at which they actually operate. That scale is larger than intuition accounts for. The mind tends to imagine the lottery as a single draw occurring in a single place, with the full weight of improbability resting on that one event. The mind is poorly suited to holding the image of hundreds of draws occurring simultaneously, week after week, here across a global calendar of games, the Bulgarian draw, and the North Carolina draw, and the Israeli draw, and the German draws, and the Czech draws, and the Polish draws, and the dozens of other draws happening in other rooms, in other time zones, each of them adding to the total from which repetition eventually emerges. When the image expands to that scale, the six numbers settling in their Sophia tray on September 10th, 2009, feel less like an event requiring explanation and more like an event that probability had always kept somewhere on its long and patient list, not scheduled, not predictable, not remarkable in the way that a genuine anomaly would be remarkable. Just one of the things that happens in the long run when draws go on occurring and the count of trials grows large enough to reach into the quieter regions of the distribution, the regions where very small probabilities, given enough opportunities, eventually resolve. The researcher in Vancouver, cursor moving slowly down through columns of global draw data, calculation running in a second window, was converging on exactly that conclusion. The calculation took what was known about the global volume of lottery draws, the frequency, the number of active games, the range of possible combinations in each, and asked at what point the cumulative probability of a repeat draw occurring somewhere in the world crossed from unlikely to expected. The answer placed that crossing well within the operational lifetime of the modern lottery system, as it actually exists and has existed for decades. The result, when it arrived, was not surprising to the researchers. It was the result the mathematics had been pointing toward from the beginning of the analysis. What the analysis did was make the pointing visible, translate the abstract structure of the probability calculation into a concrete number that could be compared against the concrete record of how often draws have actually been run. The Bulgarian government opened its investigation. The North Carolina auditors lifted their printed record. The Israeli Broadcast Control Room filed its documentation. The German Regulatory Archive received its flagged binder. All of those responses were appropriate because in each case, a thing had occurred that the oversight systems governing those lotteries were designed to notice and examine. The examination in each case found nothing more than the mathematics would have predicted, a draw that had proceeded correctly and produced a result that the system had always been capable of producing, and that the global volume of draws had always been likely to produce somewhere, eventually, for anyone willing to hold the full scale of the calendar in mind at once. The studio in Sofia continued broadcasting. The Cash 5 game in North Carolina continued drawing. The Mifal Hapaeus lottery continued its scheduled calendar. The European Regulatory Archives continued filling their shelves. The database in Vancouver continued receiving new rows of global draw results, the columns growing longer with each passing week, the cumulative total of trials growing slowly larger, the probability of a future repeat draw occurring somewhere remaining, as it has always remained, a matter of when rather than whether. Outside the studio, the city went on in the ordinary way that cities go on when something has occurred inside one building that the streets outside have not yet heard about. The numbered balls sat in their transparent tray, the studio lights overhead, the announcer having finished the read. In the long record of lottery draws around the world, the September 10th Bulgarian result joined the September 6th result in the same archive, two identical rows in the same table, the match between them quietly representing something that the mathematics of large numbers had always been prepared to accommodate, waiting only for the right draw in the right room at the right point in the long accumulated count of trials, to arrive at last, somewhere right now, in a room somewhere on the global map of operating lotteries. Another draw is proceeding. The results are being recorded. The archive is receiving another row. The count grows. The calculation in the second window keeps running. The result it converges on stays the same, patient and complete and unhurried, the way that mathematical conclusions are, indifferent to whether anyone is watching, cumulating quietly in the background of all the ordinary evenings in which numbered balls settle into transparent trays and are read aloud and filed, week after week, in the long ordinary record of chance. The drum begins to turn before the first ball moves. For a moment, in the second before the rotation finds its speed, the numbered balls simply sit against each other inside the clear acrylic chamber, their painted surfaces catching the studio light, their weights pressing softly against the curved interior wall. Then the motor engages fully, the drum commits to its cycle, and the balls begin to roll. What happens in those first few seconds of a lottery draw is both completely ordinary and genuinely precise. The balls lift away from the wall as the drum accelerates, tumbling over each other in a slow, continuous cascade, each one redirected by contact with its neighbors, no single ball following a path that could be predicted from the one before. The sound they make is a soft, rhythmic clatter, a kind of patient percussion that fills the draw room at the same volume and tempo every time, draw after draw, year after year. The mixing period is timed exactly. When the first number is released, the conditions inside the drum will have been identical, within the accepted tolerances, to the conditions that produced every previous draw conducted on the same equipment. There are two broad families of lottery draw machine in use around the world, and they arrive at randomness by different physical routes. The first family operates by gravity and rotation. The second operates by air. Both have been in official use for decades. Both are subject to the same frameworks of certification, calibration, and independent oversight that govern nearly every other aspect of the draw. The machines look different, sound different, and produce their results through different physical processes, but the institutional structures surrounding them are built to the same specifications, and those specifications are more exacting than most people who buy lottery tickets ever have occasion to consider. Gravity pick machines, which include models called the halogen and the criterion used in Powerball and Mega Millions draws in the United States, work by placing numbered balls inside a rotating drum made from acrylic or polycarbonate, a clear, rigid plastic that allows every stage of the mix to be observed continuously from outside the machine. The drum spins at a controlled speed for a controlled duration, tumbling the balls against each other in the manner described above, and when the mixing period ends, the mechanism opens a gate at the base of the drum and releases one ball at a time into a pneumatic tube that carries it forward into the display tray. The ball that falls first is the one that happened at the moment the gate opened to be positioned near it, a position determined by the accumulated random collisions of the entire mixing period. The machine does not choose. The machine only arranges the conditions under which physics chooses instead. The halogen model used in many American state draws is a quiet-looking piece of equipment when it is not running. Its drum is roughly the size of a large beach ball, mounted horizontally on a frame that sits at table height, clear enough that the numbers on the balls inside it are legible from across the room. When it runs, the drum fills with motion. The balls move constantly, lifting and falling and bouncing, their trajectories shaped by forces that are real and lawful and completely incalculable in advance. The precise starting position of each ball, the exact speed of each rotation, the minute variations in the surface contact between individual balls. These forces are not random in the strict sense that probability theory means when it uses that word. They are deterministic, but they are so sensitive to initial conditions, so small, that they produce results that are for all practical purposes indistinguishable from randomness. The ball that comes out first is not random. It is merely the ball whose trajectory, traced back through every collision in the mixing period, happened to end near the exit gate. Air mix machines work differently, and the difference is audible. Where a gravity pick machine produces the soft rolling clatter of balls tumbling in a drum, an air mix machine produces a quieter, more continuous sound, a rushing, slightly airy hiss that fills the chamber as the airflow maintains its circulation. The United Kingdom National Lottery used air mix machines for many years, naming each one Guinevere, Merlin, Arthur. The machines were given names, the way ships are given names, which perhaps reflects something about the relationship between the institution and the equipment, the sense that the machine doing the drawing was a specific object with a specific history, not simply an interchangeable device. Guinevere and her counterparts worked by injecting a steady stream of forced air into a sealed chamber filled with numbered balls, the airflow continuous enough to keep the balls moving unpredictably in all directions throughout the mixing period. At the moment of selection, the airflow was redirected briefly to guide individual balls toward a transparent exit tube at the top or side of the chamber, from which they emerged one at a time into the display. The air that moved the balls was the same air that made them unpredictable. Both machine types share one design principle that is not always obvious from looking at them. The balls used in the draw are not simply decorative spheres with numbers painted on. They are certified components manufactured and maintained to specifications that treat each one as a piece of precision equipment, because within the context of the draw, that is exactly what each one is. A lottery ball used in an official draw must meet weight and diameter tolerances held to within a fraction of a gram and a fraction of a millimeter. The figures vary by jurisdiction and by the specific ball set in use, but the principle is consistent. If any ball in the set is measurably heavier or lighter, larger or smaller than the others, its behavior inside the machine during the mixing period will differ from the others in ways that accumulate over time into a pattern. A ball that is consistently slightly heavier than its neighbors will, in a gravity pick machine, tend to settle lower during mixing. A ball that is slightly larger will make different contact with the drum wall and with other balls. Either of these differences, maintained over hundreds of draws, can produce a detectable bias, a number that appears more often than the mathematics of equal probability would predict. The tolerances exist to prevent this. They are not a courtesy. They are the engineering basis of a fair draw. Before each draw, a certified technician works through the ball set with a precision scale and a set of calibrated measurement tools. Each ball is placed on the scale individually. The digital readout, which runs to several decimal places, is checked against the accepted range for that ball set. If a ball falls outside that range, even marginally, it is removed from the draw set and replaced before the machine is loaded. The technician logs each measurement, ball by ball, in a record that accompanies the draw documentation. When the draw is complete, that log exists as evidence that the equipment used was within specification at the moment the draw occurred. The technician performing this work is not the same person who will operate the draw. In most jurisdictions, the roles are separated as a deliberate structural choice. The individual responsible for verifying the equipment and the individual responsible for conducting the draw are different people, working from different instructions, whose records are cross-referenced afterward. This separation is not bureaucratic redundancy. It is one layer in a system that has been designed over many decades and through accumulated experience with what can go wrong to make it very difficult for a single point of failure, whether a miscalibrated scale, a fatigued technician, or any other source of error, to affect the draw outcome without that effect being noticed. The balls themselves have a custodial history that is maintained separately from the draw records. In the United States, the Multi-State Lottery Association maintains a ball custody archive in which sealed sets of numbered balls are stored in labeled transparent containers on shelved rows, each container tagged with a chain of custody record. That record traces every draw the ball set has been used in, every inspection it has undergone, and every individual who has had authorized access to it between draws. A ball set used in a Powerball draw on a Tuesday evening has a documented history that extends back to its manufacture, and that history is not considered complete until the ball set is retired from service. The custody record is, in one sense, simply a practical tool. It allows investigators to trace any anomaly in a draw back to the specific equipment used, verify who handled it, and confirm that the handling was authorized and logged. But it is also something else, a record of the mundane, repeated steps that constitute almost all of what lottery operation involves. Most chain of custody entries are not interesting. They describe a ball set removed from storage by an authorized individual at a logged time, inspected, loaded into the machine, used in the draw, inspected again, returned to storage, sealed, and logged back in. The same steps in the same order, producing the same documentation, draw after draw. The record is useful precisely because it is unvarying, because the absence of a step or the presence of an unauthorized access is immediately visible against the baseline of ordinary entries. Independent auditing of lottery draws is a legal requirement in most of the jurisdictions that operate them, and the auditing function extends well beyond simply watching the draw happen. Firms including Scientific Games and Smart Play International work as third-party equipment certifiers in the United States, arriving before draws to conduct pre-draw inspections, remaining to witness the live draw, and filing official reports with gaming regulatory authorities afterward. The pre-draw inspection covers the draw equipment, the ball sets, the draw location, and the chain of custody records for all equipment used. The witness function covers the draw itself. The auditor observes and documents what occurred, comparing it against established protocols and noting any deviation, however minor. The post-draw report becomes part of the official record. The auditors who perform this work are not lottery employees. Their professional and financial relationship is with the regulatory bodies that commission them, not with the operators whose draws they audit, and this structural independence is understood by both parties to be the precondition that makes the auditing function meaningful. A post-draw report filed by an auditor whose employment depended on the lottery's continued satisfaction would mean something different from a report filed by one whose employment is entirely independent of the outcome. The independence is the point. What the auditor witnesses during the draw is the full sequence of a precisely managed procedure. The draw room is set up to a specific configuration. The equipment has been inspected and sealed. The ball sets have been verified and logged. The draw personnel are identified and their access is recorded. The mixing period begins at a specified time. The numbers are released in sequence, documented in real time, verified against the display by the witness. When the last number has been drawn, the equipment is sealed again. The draw personnel exit in a logged sequence, and the auditor's record is the last document added to the official draw file before it is closed. Every draw, everywhere, is a version of this process. It is worth sitting with the quietness of all of this, not the quietness of the room specifically, though the draw rooms tend to be quiet, but the quietness of a system that does its work in the same way every time, with the same documentation, the same verification, the same chain of hands that each ball passes through between draws. The machinery is not dramatic. The procedure is not dramatic. The numbers that emerge from it are statistically unremarkable, and yet each draw is in its own small way a managed event, a moment at which the physical world produces a result that is certified as the product of a fair and supervised process, and then that certification is filed, and the equipment is sealed, and the room is restored to its ordinary condition. In July of 2016, in the Philippines, a draw conducted by the PCSO, the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office, was interrupted when the draw machine experienced a mechanical fault mid-draw. The specific nature of the fault was that the machine stopped producing results before the full set of numbers for the draw had been released. The draw was in progress. Some numbers had already been drawn. The machine stopped. The response to this interruption was not to complete the draw with the equipment in its current state, and it was not to simply cancel the draw without explanation. The entire draw was voided. A formal public disclosure was made. An independent review was commissioned. The review examined the equipment, the draw records, the timeline of the fault, and the circumstances under which the interruption had occurred. The replacement draw was not conducted until that review had been completed and the equipment had been verified as operating within specification. No fraud was found. No deliberate interference was identified. The fault was mechanical, the kind of thing that happens to equipment that is used repeatedly in a controlled environment, and that, when it does happen, is visible immediately to everyone present, and in the draw record, simultaneously. The incident was documented thoroughly. The documentation went into the official record. The replacement draw was conducted under the same conditions of independent oversight as any other draw, and its results were certified in the same way. The thoroughness of the response to that 2016 fault is in one sense proportionate to the fact that a draw is a high-stakes event. High stakes not because of drama, but because of the scale of the trust that the draw represents. A lottery operates on the premise that the numbers produced by its draws are the product of a fair, unsupervised process, that no person or institution knew in advance what those numbers would be, and that no person or institution was in a position to influence what they would be. When a draw is interrupted before completion, that premise is not yet violated, but it is temporarily suspended. The draw is in an indeterminate state, and the response is to resolve that indeterminate state as clearly and publicly as possible before any replacement draw occurs. The voiding of the draw, the public disclosure, and the independent review are all steps toward restoring the premise that makes the replacement draw meaningful. The draw room in the Philippines, after the 2016 fault had been documented and the review had been initiated, would have looked much like any other draw room after a draw. The machine stands sealed under a tamper-evident cover. The draw personnel have exited. The investigators work through the equipment log and the fault record at a table nearby, cross-referencing timestamps, checking the sequence of events against the expected sequence. The paperwork accumulates slowly. The room is otherwise quiet. Outside, people who had purchased tickets for the voided draw are waiting for the replacement to be scheduled, and the institution is doing the work of explaining publicly what occurred and when the replacement will happen. Inside, the process of documentation continues at its own pace, methodical and unhurried, the investigators taking the time the review requires, rather than the time that would be most convenient. This is most of what lottery administration looks like, most of the time. Not the draws themselves. The draws are brief, conducted according to a fixed protocol, and over quickly. The surrounding work is what occupies the larger share of the hours. The ball inspections, the custody records, the equipment certifications, the audit reports, the reviews, the logs. A lottery draw that produces its results in 3 minutes is the endpoint of a process that began days earlier with ball verification and will continue days later with the auditor's report being filed. The 3 minutes in front of the camera are the most visible part of a much longer, quieter procedure. The cameras themselves are part of that procedure. Draw rooms are monitored continuously on video, with recording from multiple angles that cover the equipment, the personnel, and the draw itself simultaneously. The footage is retained as part of the draw record. If a question is raised about any aspect of a draw, if a number is disputed, if equipment behavior is questioned, if a procedural step is alleged to have been skipped, the video record is one of the first resources that investigators consult because it provides a contemporaneous account of what occurred that is independent of any participant's memory or report. The multi-angle arrangement ensures that no single camera angle can fail to capture the full draw without other angles providing coverage. In the design of this surveillance system, as in the design of the ball custody records, the dual role separation of draw personnel and the independent auditing function, the underlying principle is the same. No single element of the draw, no individual ball, no single camera, no one technician, no one auditor is trusted to carry the entire weight of verification on its own. The system is built from overlapping records and independent observations, such that the failure or corruption of any one element leaves the others intact. A ball that is miscalibrated will be caught by the pre-draw inspection. A draw that is interrupted will be caught by the voiding procedure and the public disclosure. A piece of draw footage that is unclear will be supplemented by footage from other angles. An auditor who files an inaccurate report will file it against a set of independent records that can be checked against it. The word for this kind of design is redundancy, though that word undersells it. Redundancy in engineering means having backup systems that can take over when primary systems fail. What the draw process has is something slightly different, not backup systems, but parallel systems that are all running simultaneously and whose outputs are compared against each other. The ball weight log, the custody record, the draw footage, the auditor's report, and the gaming regulator's oversight file are not arranged in sequence, with each one serving as a backup to the previous. They are generated in parallel from independent sources, and their consistency with each other is part of what the post-draw review confirms. When all of them agree, that agreement is the certification. When any of them diverges from the others, the divergence is the finding. A certified technician at a stainless steel workbench, setting each ball from a lottery set onto a precision scale and making a small mark in a log beside each ball number, is doing something that appears, from a distance, to be simple and slightly tedious. The ball is placed on the scale. The readout is checked. The mark is made. The next ball is placed. The action repeats as many times as there are balls in the set. The technician has done this before. The balls are familiar. The scale is familiar. The log format is familiar. Nothing about the procedure taken on its own is particularly interesting to observe. What makes the procedure interesting is the position it occupies in the larger structure. That small mark in the log beside each ball number is the first link in a chain of documentation that will extend from this workbench through the draw room, through the auditor's report, and into the regulatory file that will sit on a shelf in a gaming commission office for however many years the record retention requirement specifies. The mark is small, the chain is long, and the chain is long specifically because many people in many different institutions, working from different positions within the same system, have determined over time that a chain of this length and this composition is what is required to produce draws, whose results can be trusted without reservation. The precision scale used for ball certification typically reads to 5 decimal places. The accepted tolerance for ball weight in most official draw sets is narrow enough that the difference between an acceptable ball and an unacceptable one is not something a person could detect by holding the two balls simultaneously. The scale detects it, the log records it. The pre-draw inspection report confirms that the detection was performed. This is what the tolerance means in practice. Not that any human being can feel the difference, but that the measurement system can find it, and that finding it is recorded. The material the balls are made from varies by manufacturer and by the specific machine type they are designed for. Air mix machines typically use lighter balls than gravity pick machines because the air pressure used to circulate them is calibrated to the weight of the balls in the set, and the entire system, airflow, ball weight, chamber dimensions, is designed as an integrated unit. Changing one parameter without adjusting the others would alter the behavior of the circulation in ways that might not be obvious from outside the machine, but would show up over many draws as a statistical anomaly in the results. This is why the ball certification records for air mix machines track not just absolute weight, but consistency across the set. The question is not only whether any individual ball is within tolerance, but whether all the balls in the set are within tolerance of each other. For the balls used in gravity pick machines, the relevant concern is slightly different. In a rotating drum, The dominant force acting on the balls during mixing is gravity, and gravity acts on mass. A ball that is heavier than the others will, during any given mixing cycle, tend to be lower in the drum at the moment of selection, not every time, because the specific pattern of collisions varies, but on average over many draws. The pre-draw inspection exists partly to prevent this average from developing. By removing any ball that falls outside the weight tolerance before the draw, the inspection maintains the condition under which gravity acts equally on all balls in the mix, and the draw outcome remains undetermined by the masses of the balls. The balls used in official draws are retired from service on a schedule that varies by jurisdiction, but is typically determined by a combination of total number of draws in service and the results of periodic condition inspections. A ball that shows surface wear, paint degradation, or any structural change that could affect its behavior in the machine is withdrawn from service, regardless of where it falls in the rotation schedule. Retired ball sets are not destroyed immediately. They are held in archive, often for the same period as other draw records, on the grounds that they may be needed as evidence in any subsequent review of draws in which they were used. The archive of retired ball sets is a physical space that most lottery players will never see and rarely think about. It is, in its way, a record of draws, not the numbers that came out of them, but the specific objects that the numbers came out of. A shelf of sealed containers holding retired ball sets from years of Powerball draws is a material record of the randomness that those draws produced, held in a room that is quiet and climate-controlled and lit at the level required for legibility of the labels, rather than the level required for any activity that involves seeing things carefully. The balls in those containers are inert. They are no longer in service. They have been superseded by newer sets, certified and logged, and placed in the custody chain in their turn. The archive simply holds what came before, in case anyone needs to go back to it. The physical scale of a well-maintained lottery archive is not enormous. The containers are not large. The ball sets from any one jurisdiction number only in the dozens or hundreds, and the records that accompany them are filed documents rather than anything that takes up significant space on its own. But the archive represents the full institutional commitment to the draw's integrity over time. The records in it are not produced in the event of a problem. They are produced routinely as a matter of standard procedure in the expectation that they will not be needed, and in the understanding that if they are needed, they will be complete. This is the orientation of the entire draw procedure when it is working as designed. The ball log, the custody record, the auditor's report, the draw footage, the regulatory file. All of it is produced, not because a problem is anticipated, but because the system is designed to be reviewable from the outside at any point by anyone with the appropriate authorization, and to provide a complete and consistent account of everything that occurred. The draw, from this perspective, is not a secret, it is a documented event. Its documentation is what makes the result real in the institutional sense, not simply a fact about the world, but a certified fact, embedded in a chain of records that can be examined and verified. The draw machine standing sealed in the Philippines draw room after the 2016 fault, with its tamper-evident cover in place, and the investigators working through the documentation at a nearby table, is an image of this orientation in a specific moment. The machine is not running. The draw it was interrupted in has been voided. The replacement has not yet been scheduled. But the documentation of what occurred is already underway, and when it is complete, it will be filed in the same place as every other draw record, as evidence that the procedure, even when it was interrupted, was handled in accordance with the protocols that govern it. The machine, sealed and still and surrounded by the quiet work of review, is not a sign that something failed. It is a sign that something is working exactly as it was designed to. The draw room itself, when the replacement draw is eventually conducted, will look the same as it looked before. The balls will be verified and logged. The machine will be loaded and sealed until the moment of the draw. The auditor will be present, the cameras will be running, the mixing period will begin, and the balls will tumble inside their clear chamber, moving against each other in the continuous soft motion that the machine produces each time, and one by one, the numbers will be released into the display, and the draw will be documented, and the documentation will be filed, and the room will return to its quiet, ordinary condition. The machine, sealed again under its tamper-evident cover, the draw record complete and stored, the process finished and ready to begin again. Outside, the numbers will mean something to people who purchase tickets. Inside the draw room, the numbers are the output of a physical process that has been verified, witnessed, and recorded according to a protocol developed over many years and many draws to produce exactly the kind of result it produced. A result that can be trusted because the conditions under which it was produced have been documented in enough detail from enough independent sources that the trust is not simply offered but justified by a chain of evidence that anyone with access to the record can follow from beginning to end. The drum that began to turn at the start of all this, the balls tumbling slowly into motion, the sound of them moving in the moments before the first number was released. That physical event is what the procedure is built around. Everything before it is preparation. Everything after it is documentation. The event itself is brief, mechanical, and unremarkable in the sense that it proceeds the same way each time, producing its result through forces that are real and physical and deterministic and for practical purposes completely beyond prediction. That combination, the predictability of the procedure and the unpredictability of the result, is what the whole structure is designed to protect. The machine does not guarantee a fair draw by being a perfect machine. It participates in a fair draw by being a certified, calibrated, witnessed, documented machine, surrounded by all the quiet institutional care that those words imply. The draw room after the draw is always still, the machine sealed under its cover, the auditor filing the last pages of the report, the custody log returned to storage, the footage continuing to record the empty room for however long the protocol requires before the recording is archived. The process that produced the numbers is finished. The numbers exist now in the draw record, in the public announcement, and eventually in the archive of draws, where they will sit alongside every other set of numbers produced by the same procedure, in the same room, by the same calibrated machine, turning its balls in the same measured, documented, carefully tended way. 23 people are standing in a room together. The room is ordinary, fluorescent lights, a low ceiling, the kind of chairs that stack. Someone has arranged them in a rough circle, and they are looking at each other the way people look at each other when they are not sure yet what the exercise requires. Then two of them discover that they were born on the same day of the same month, not the same year, just the same day, the 14th of March, say, or the 9th of November. One of them says the date first, and the other one looks up with that particular expression that falls somewhere between recognition and mild disbelief. The room makes a small sound of collective interest. It feels like a coincidence. It feels for a moment like something that should not have been expected. The mathematics underneath that moment have a name. Most people who know it call it the birthday paradox, though it is not precisely a paradox, Nothing in it contradicts itself or breaks the rules of logic. What it does is reveal how badly the mind estimates the probability of pairing. The problem is not with the dates themselves. The problem is with the number of possible connections between people in a room and how quickly that number grows. In a group of 23 people, there are 253 distinct pairs. Each pair is a separate opportunity for a match. The mind, when it hears 23, thinks of 23 chances. The probability machinery, when it evaluates 23 people, counts 253. Those two numbers point in very different directions, and the distance between them is where the surprise lives. Across those 253 pairs, each one carrying its own small chance of a shared birthday, the cumulative probability that at least one match exists somewhere in the group rises above 50%, past the midpoint, more likely than not. The number that produced that surprise, 23, is quite small. A classroom, a committee, a modest dinner party. The surprise was not in the room with those two people on the 14th of March. The surprise was always going to be somewhere in the room. The question was only which two people it would find. That logic, which feels contained and domestic when applied to birthdays in a circle of chairs, opens outward into something considerably wider when it is applied to lottery draws. The pairings are not between people, they are between draws. Every draw that has ever occurred in the long operating history of a given lottery game is a potential partner for every other draw. A lottery that has been running twice a week for 30 years has produced more than 3,000 draws. 3,000 draws create more than 4 million possible pairs. Each pair is a separate opportunity for a match. The number 4 million does not describe the improbability of a repeat. It describes the number of chances for one to occur. A standard 6 from 49 lottery has 13,983,816 possible combinations. The formula that produces this number is expressed as C of n and k, which means the number of ways to choose k items from a pool of n without repetition and without regard to order. For a pick-6 game with balls numbered 1 through 49, n is 49 and k is 6, and the arithmetic resolves to that large, specific number. On a single-pair basis, 2 successive draws, nothing more. The probability that both draws produce the identical combination is approximately 1 in 13.98 million. Written out long, that fraction is small enough to look like noise, like a smudge on the page rather than a number worth attending to. A single pair of draws, 1 in nearly 14 million. The mind hears that and relaxes. The mind files it under impossible. Then the lottery continues drawing twice a week, as it has for decades, and the number of pairs accumulates with quiet, indifferent arithmetic. After 1 year of twice-weekly draws, there are approximately 5,350 pairs to evaluate, not one. After 10 years, the number of pairs approaches 2.5 million. After 30 years, working through the same compound growth, the total reaches a figure that makes the originally impossible-seeming fraction feel considerably less settled. The probability per pair remains fixed at 1 in 13.98 million. The number of pairs does not remain fixed. It grows every time a draw occurs, without exception, adding new potential partners for every previous result in the archive. The law of large numbers is the name given to this patient arithmetic. It is a formal observation about what happens to rare events when given sufficient opportunities. A coin flip that lands heads 1% of the time is not a coin that avoids landing heads. It is a coin that across 10,000 flips will land heads approximately 100 times. The rarity of the event per trial does not prevent the event. It only governs its frequency across trials. Applied to lottery draws, the law says something straightforward. A combination that has appeared once is not protected from appearing again. Nothing in the physics of the draw system remembers what has already come up. Nothing removes a past winner from the pool of future possibilities. The balls tumble with complete indifference to the records sitting in the Lottery Commission's archive. In a chalk-dusted lecture room in Sofia, a probability theorist named Mihail Konstantinov sat with a number on the board behind him. The fraction read 1 over 13,983,816. He had written it in the days following the Bulgarian National Lottery's September 2009 repeat draw, when the same six numbers, 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, and 42, had appeared in successive draws just 4 days apart. The public's reaction to those draws had been swift and certain. Something was wrong, someone had interfered, the coincidence was too large to have arrived honestly. Konstantinov's position was different. The coincidence was real. The arithmetic was the part that needed correcting. What Konstantinov pointed toward, in the accounts of his statements that circulated widely after the Bulgarian incident, was the gap between how the fraction looked in isolation and what it meant across the full operating history of the game. The question was not, what is the chance that these two specific draws, on September 6th and September 10th, would produce the same result? A question framed that narrowly will always produce a very small answer. The question that probability theory asks instead is, across all the draws this game has conducted, across all the pairs those draws generate, what is the chance that at least one pair, somewhere in the record, produces identical results? That question has a larger answer, a meaningfully larger answer. Konstantinov was widely reported as saying that the public's shock reflected a misunderstanding of probability rather than evidence of anything improper, and the government investigation that followed the Bulgarian draws ultimately reached the same conclusion through its own institutional process. The same observation arrived from different cities after different draws. In New York, following the North Carolina Cash 5 repeat in 2011, where the 5 winning numbers 21, 27, 35, 39, and 41 appeared in successive draws just 48 hours apart, a statistician at Columbia University named Andrew Gelman offered a version of the same correction. The numbers on the two printed records, sitting side by side in identical columns, looked like evidence of interference, looked like something that needed explaining. Gelman's position was that the draws did need explaining, but not in the way the reaction implied. The explanation was probability applied to large numbers of trials over long periods of time, and it was an explanation that made the coincidence not less real, but considerably less surprising. The record of the draw and the record of the mathematics pointed in the same direction. In Jerusalem, some months after the Israeli state lottery drew a 6-number combination in October of 2010 that had appeared in an earlier draw in September of the same year, a mathematician at Hebrew University named Nira Dine gave an interview to the newspaper Haaretz. The combination had been drawn on live television, and the footage had spread quickly, carrying with it the weight of visible, witnessed improbability. Dine's observation, as reported in the interview, was precise in its reframing. She said the real question was not whether identical numbers would be drawn twice, but when, not if. When. The question was only ever one of timing, not of possibility. That reframing is worth sitting with. The difference between if and when is the difference between treating repetition as a violation of the rules and treating it as an outcome those rules produce, eventually, given enough time. When the Bulgarian draw repeated, it repeated within a lottery system that had been operating for years. When the North Carolina numbers appeared twice in 48 hours, they appeared within a game that had been drawing results for well over a decade. When the Israeli combination showed up twice in 5 weeks, it did so inside a lottery with a long continuous operating history. In each case, the archive of draws behind the repeat was the part of the story that probability theory needed to tell. The repeat was the front page. The archive was the explanation. A cognitive tendency called apophenia describes something the human mind does with particular consistency. It perceives meaningful patterns in events that have not been organized by any pattern-making process. The word comes from the Greek for showing forth, and it describes the experience of seeing a face in random marks on a wall, or a message in the order of leaves, or deliberate coordination in 2 lottery draws that happen to share their numbers. The mind is an extraordinarily capable pattern detector, shaped by a long history in which detecting patterns, regularities in animal behavior, in weather, in the actions of other people was directly useful. A false positive in that history cost very little. A missed pattern could cost considerably more. So the machinery runs warm, and it finds connections that are not there, and it experiences those findings as discovery rather than confabulation. Applied to the Bulgarian draw, or the North Carolina draw, or the Israeli draw, that machinery produced a very specific and very understandable result, the experience of certainty that something deliberate had occurred. 2 identical sets of numbers, in sequence, under studio lights, witnessed and recorded. The pattern-finding system treated that as signal. The mathematics treated it as noise, not in the sense of something unimportant, but in the technical sense of an event that carries no information about cause because its occurrence was always within the range of expected outcomes across sufficient trials. The machinery that found the pattern and the mathematics that analyzed the pattern were both functioning correctly. They were simply looking at different things. One was looking at the draws, the other was looking at the draws and everything that came before them. The important note here is not that the public reactions were foolish or poorly reasoned. The people who looked at 2 identical lottery results and felt certain that the explanation was interference were applying exactly the kind of reasoning that works well in most situations. When a thing looks improbable from the inside of the moment, the mind quite sensibly goes looking for a cause. The gap between that intuition and the mathematical picture is not a failure of intelligence. It is a structural feature of how the mind processes probability, and statisticians who describe this gap do so with something closer to recognition than correction. There is a long archival printout in a university database in Vancouver that stretches across several screens when scrolled through at a measured pace. The researchers who assembled it at the University of British Columbia were working through a question that looked modest when stated simply. Given all the lottery draws occurring each week across all the active lottery games in the world, what does the cumulative probability of at least one repeat draw occurring somewhere in the world within any given decade actually amount to? The question required compiling data, hundreds of draws per week across dozens of countries, with games ranging from small regional lotteries with narrow pools to large national draws with much larger combination spaces. The cursor moved slowly down columns of results, while a calculation ran in a second window. The answer, when the calculation converged, was not the number most people would have guessed. The researchers, writing in 2010, noted that when the full portfolio of active global lottery games is taken into account, The cumulative probability of at least one repeat draw occurring somewhere in the world within a decade rises to a level that statisticians describe as meaningful rather than negligible. The precise figure was not the point of the finding. The shape of the finding was the point, that the global lottery system, considered as a whole rather than as a collection of separate improbable events, was large enough and active enough that repetitions were not accidents of extraordinary fortune, but outcomes that the aggregate probability distribution was quietly expecting. This is what the birthday paradox looks like at full scale. Not 23 people in a room with 165 days of year to fill, but thousands of draws a week across a global system with dozens of active games, each one adding new results to an archive of potential pairs that grows continuously. The pairs do not have to find each other quickly. They do not have to find each other in any particular game, or country, or decade. The mathematics requires only that they be given enough time and enough trials, and across the operating history of the global lottery industry, both conditions have been met by a considerable margin. A 6 from 49 combination space contains nearly 14 million possible results. That number is fixed. It does not grow. Every draw that occurs anywhere reduces, in a technical sense, the remaining space of combinations that have not yet appeared, though the game itself has no memory of this, and draws continue with complete independence from what has come before. The independence is the important part. Each draw is sealed from every other draw in terms of cause and effect. A number that has appeared 100 times in a game's history has precisely the same probability of appearing on the next draw as a number that has never appeared at all. The lottery does not correct for previous results. It does not avoid repeating itself. The historical record is not consulted during the draw. The balls move without reference to anything. That independence is also what generates the counterintuitive arithmetic of the birthday problem. Because each draw is independent, and because each draw is drawn from the same fixed pool of possible results, the results accumulate in the archive without any force preventing them from eventually overlapping. The independence that prevents any draw from predicting the next one is the same independence that allows any two draws taken from anywhere in the archive to share their result without violating any rule the system operates under. The repeat is not a breakdown. The repeat is what independence, given enough time, occasionally produces. Konstantinov's fraction on the chalkboard, 1/13,983,816, is the right number for a single pair of draws. It is a very honest number. It says exactly what the probability is when two draws are evaluated in isolation. What the chalkboard could not hold in the space behind that fraction was the rest of the archive, the thousands of draws that preceded the Bulgarian September repeat, the millions of pairs those draws collectively generated, the accumulated weight of trials that had been quietly running the probability calculation forward, draw by draw, without anyone watching the total climb. The fraction on the board was correct. It was also incomplete without the context in which it had finally resolved. The mind tends to evaluate a surprising event against its own probability per trial, and then stop. The weather of a single afternoon is judged against the baseline for that afternoon. The behavior of a single person is judged against what that person usually does. The appearance of a repeated lottery combination is judged against the odds that two specific adjacent draws would match. In each case, the judgment is locally coherent and globally incomplete. The question the judgment leaves out is always the same one: how many draws, how many afternoons, How many observations preceded the one that finally came up surprising? The answer to that question changes everything about what surprising means. A researcher in Vancouver scrolls through a long database late in the afternoon, the light coming through a west-facing window at a low angle. The columns of numbers are dense and regular. Most of the rows are unremarkable, draws that produce their result and passed into the archive without attracting attention. Some rows are flagged, marked with the small notations that the data entry process applied to documented cases of unusual outcomes. The repeat draws are among those. Not many of them relative to the total. The total is very large. The total is the point. Every row in the database is a trial. Every pair of rows is a test of independence. The archive, read as a whole rather than line by line, is a record of how probability behaves across the kind of time frame and volume that allows rare outcomes to eventually appear. The Bulgarian numbers 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, and 42 appear twice in the archive, 4 days apart, and the appearance is correct. Not fraudulent, not manipulated, not the product of any process other than the lottery's own draw system, doing what draw systems do, selecting randomly from a fixed pool of combinations, without memory, without preference, without any mechanism to prevent a result that has appeared before from appearing again. The investigation that followed found no fraud. The mathematics had not expected fraud. The mathematics had been quietly accounting for this possibility for as long as the draws had been accumulating. And in North Carolina, in July of 2011, the Cash 5 numbers 2127, 3539, and 41 settled into the display on 2 consecutive evenings, and an auditor lifted a printed record and looked at 2 columns of figures that were identical across their full length. The audit found no irregularity in the equipment. The numbers were simply the numbers, 48 hours apart, drawn from the same pool by the same process, operating under the same rules, and the pool did not prevent them from arriving at the same conclusion. The auditor filed the report. The report joined the archive. The archive continued to grow. The Israel draw played out on live television on October 16th of 2010, and a technician in a broadcast control room quietly checked the September record against what had just appeared on the monitor. The 2 lines of 6 numbers sat identically on the page. Lottery authorities issued a statement. The statement said what the mathematics had already established. The combination had appeared before. The draw had been conducted correctly. The archive now contained the entry twice. Nothing in the rules of the draw system prevented this. Nothing in the physics of independently drawn combinations excludes repetition. The live footage of the draw, which spread rapidly and arrived to viewers already carrying the assumption that such a thing could not simply happen, was a record of something that can simply happen, and has, and will again, somewhere in the world, in a game whose archive has grown large enough to render the event expected. The German Regulatory Archive and the records maintained by lottery authorities in the Czech Republic and Poland, and the documented near repeat and exact repeat incidents that European gaming regulators have reviewed across 3 decades, all add their entries to the same large picture. Each incident reviewed, each machine serviced, each protocol updated, the accumulation of institutional response to these events is its own kind of record. The binders on those shelves, each flagged incident marked with a small adhesive tab, are not a record of failures. They are a record of a system encountering, periodically, the outcomes that its own probability structure eventually produces, and responding to each one with the same careful institutional process. The independence of lottery draws is not just a statistical property. It is also a kind of quiet fairness, because each draw is sealed from every other draw. No outcome is owed to any ticket holder, and no result is prohibited by any previous result. The system is not trying to spread its results evenly across the combination space. It is not trying to avoid repetition, it is simply drawing, and the draws accumulate, and occasionally across the long operating histories of games that have been running for decades, two of those draws find each other in the archive and settle into an identical configuration. The event is real, the surprise is appropriate, the mathematics accommodates it without effort. Niradine, sitting with the Haaretz article on a sunlit table in Jerusalem, had offered the question in its clearest form, not whether identical lottery numbers would appear twice, but when. The when arrived in Bulgaria in September of 2009. It had arrived in North Carolina in July of 2011. It had arrived in Israel in October of 2010. It had arrived in smaller and less publicized incidents across European lotteries over 3 decades of operation. Each time, the investigation concluded correctly, and the mathematics had already concluded the same thing before any investigator filed a single page. The when was always a matter of how many draws, how many pairs, how many accumulated trials the global lottery system had been quietly generating since the first ball ever tumbled in the first drum. There is something in that picture that is not alarming and not small. It is a picture of how randomness behaves across long stretches of time, and the picture has a particular quality that is not easy to name quickly, but is not hard to feel once it settles. Randomness, given enough room and enough time, does not produce endless variety. It produces everything that its rules allow, including repetition, including the appearance of pattern, including outcomes that look like signal and turn out to be the quiet arithmetic of independence, working through the full space of its own possibilities. The archive of lottery draws around the world is one of the longer and more thoroughly documented records of randomness operating at scale that exists in any public form. What it shows, read carefully, and in its entirety, is not chaos and not order, but something that sits between them and has the particular patience of something that was always going to arrive at its destination, without hurry, on whatever day the numbers finally came around again. The researcher in Vancouver closes the database window when the calculation finishes. The result sits in the second window, clear and specific, and it is smaller than most people would guess. The cumulative probability of a repeat draw within any given decade of global lottery operation. Smaller than intuition suggested it should be, perhaps, but not small in the absolute sense. Not negligible. Within the range that the birthday paradox's arithmetic had been pointing toward since the beginning. The cursor moves, the window closes, the archive remains. Somewhere in the world, at this moment, a lottery draw is being conducted in a room with good lighting and a transparent drum and a certified result that will join the long record of all the draws that came before it, each one adding one more row to the archive, one more entry in the accumulating tally of trials, and one more step in the patient arithmetic that makes repetition not an accident, but a soft mathematical inevitability, arriving eventually somewhere in a draw that looks exactly like one that has already been. Niradine's question, not whether, but when, sits at the still center of all of it. The when is never fixed in advance. It is always an outcome of the total of the accumulated weight of draws, piling up across years and decades in games operating on multiple continents, each one independent, each one adding its result to a space that has no memory and no preference, and no reason to hold back the combination that appeared last month from appearing again this month or next year or in 20 years. Whenever the arithmetic of large numbers quietly arrives at the moment, it was always traveling toward, unhurried, through all the ordinary draws in between. Inside a small convenience store in Bishop, Texas, the scratch-off lottery tickets hang in a long pleated display rack beside the register, each card sealed in its coating of silver latex, each one holding its number beneath a surface that has not yet been disturbed. Joan Ginther reached toward that rack. The act was ordinary. Her fingers found the edge of a card and drew it free from the display, and the fluorescent light overhead was the same light that fell on every other transaction made in that store on that day, the same flat, even brightness that illuminated the shelves of canned goods and the cooler case near the back and the worn linoleum underfoot. Nothing about the moment announced itself. Nothing in the air of Bishop, a town of fewer than 3,000 people set in the flat, dry country of South Texas, suggested that what was happening at that counter was anything other than what it appeared to be. Joan Ginther won that ticket. She had won major lottery prizes 4 times in total, over a span of 17 years, all of them from Texas Lottery scratch-off tickets purchased in or near Bishop. The first win came in 1993, a prize of $5.4 million. The second came in 2006, worth $2 million. The third followed in 2008 at $3 million. The fourth, purchased at that same small store on a road in Bishop, brought $10 million more. The combined total across those 4 wins reached approximately $20.4 million, a figure that sits on the page with a kind of arithmetic patience, waiting for an explanation that has never fully arrived. No fraud was ever proven. No formal allegation was ever made. What investigators and journalists and statisticians found, when they looked closely, was a cluster of documented wins and an absence of any clear mechanism to account for them, which is, in the end, a different thing from proof of anything at all. Ginther had a doctorate in statistics from Stanford University, a fact that has been noted in nearly every account of her wins, and that carries whatever weight the reader chooses to give it. Whether that background informed her approach to scratch-off ticket selection, and whether any approach could produce results like hers from what are nominally random draws, are questions that have been discussed at length and answered only incompletely. The games she played printed their winning tickets at known intervals. Certain scratch-off formats distribute winning cards in predictable ratios across boxes of tickets, and whether knowledge of those distributions could be leveraged systematically is a question that the Texas Lottery Commission's own protocols were designed to prevent from being answered too cleanly. What remains is the record itself. 4 wins, 1 person, 1 small town in a flat stretch of South Texas, the display rack of silver-coated cards hanging in the fluorescent light. There is a particular quality to a story that refuses to close neatly. Joan Ginther's story has that quality. It does not close. It sits open at one end, the way an envelope does when the flap has not been pressed down, and the facts inside it are real and documented and insufficient to settle the matter in either direction. 4 wins, $20.4 million, a statistical background. Bishop, Texas, the cards hanging in the rack. The act of reaching. Stefan Mandel came to the lottery from a different direction entirely, and the direction he came from was arithmetic. In Romania in the 1960s, Mandel was a working economist with a specific problem. He needed money to leave the country, and the official channels for accumulating it were limited. He turned to the lottery not as a gambler but as a mathematician, and the question he asked was not which numbers would win, but whether it was possible to structure ticket purchases so that winning became a matter of coverage rather than chance. The algorithm he developed over years of careful work was a form of combinatorial condensation, a method of identifying the minimum number of tickets needed to guarantee that at least some of them covered the winning combination in lotteries with smaller number pools. In Romania, working with a small investment group, he won enough to fund his emigration. The mathematics had worked. He kept the method. He brought it with him, moving first to Israel and then to Australia, where he ran investor syndicates through the 1980s and deployed his algorithm across Australian state lotteries, winning 14 jackpots in total across multiple countries over the course of 2 decades. What he was doing was legal. It was also, in the strict sense, not gambling, or at least not gambling in the way the word is usually understood, which involves accepting the full weight of the odds. Mandel's approach was to reduce those odds to near certainty through the purchase of enough tickets to cover nearly every possible combination, then to ensure the prize outweighed the cost of the tickets, plus the overhead of the syndicate. It was an exercise in applied mathematics, wearing a lottery ticket. His most consequential operation happened in 1992 in Virginia. The Virginia lottery at that time had a jackpot game with a total of 7,059,052 possible number combinations. The jackpot had grown to $27 million. Mandel's syndicate, organized through a network of investors across multiple countries and operating from a base in Melbourne, calculated that purchasing tickets to cover virtually every combination would cost approximately $5 million, a sum that subtracted from $27 million, left a meaningful margin even after accounting for smaller prizes won along the way and the considerable logistical costs involved. They arranged the printing of just over 5 million tickets. A warehouse in Virginia was used to sort and organize them. The physical volume of paper that filled that space, 5 million individual tickets, each bearing a unique number combination, each printed and counted and prepared for submission, was enough to make the mathematical logic of the operation visible as something tangible and industrial rather than merely theoretical. The syndicate won the jackpot. It was entirely legal. Mandel appeared on American television to explain, with calm precision, what his group had done and how it had been done. Lottery authorities across Virginia and several other states subsequently changed their rules to prohibit bulk purchase schemes of the kind Mandel had used. The Australian government made similar changes. Mandel himself eventually settled in Vanuatu, a Pacific island nation, and lived there quietly for many years. The algorithm that had carried him from Romania to Melbourne to a warehouse in Virginia was not destroyed by these regulatory changes. It simply became inapplicable to any lottery large enough to be worth the investment. The mathematics remained. The windows closed around it. There is something in Mandel's story that feels almost classical. The lone figure who finds the seam in a system and moves through it cleanly, not by force or deception, but by understanding the structure better than the structure's designers had anticipated. His 14 wins were not the result of luck. They were the result of coverage, patience, and a very clear-eyed approach to what a lottery actually is: a probability space, finite and innumerable, available in principle to anyone willing to buy enough of it. The authorities who changed the rules after his Virginia win were not wrong to do so. The rules existed for a reason, and Mandel was not wrong in any legal sense to use the rules as he found them. The two positions sat beside each other without contradiction, and the regulatory changes that followed were simply the system updating itself to account for a kind of intelligence it had not fully anticipated. Jack Whittaker won his prize on Christmas Day. The year was 2002, and the game was Powerball, and the jackpot was $314.9 million, the largest ever won by a single ticket in American lottery history at that time. He was from Scott Depot, West Virginia, a modest place, and on the morning of December 26th, he was still the same person he had been the day before, except that he was now holding a slip of paper with a value that most people will never encounter, even in the abstract. He took the lump sum payment, which after taxes came to approximately $113 million. The house in Scott Depot was quiet around him. The win had not yet become the thing it would become. Jack Whitaker was already a successful contractor before the win. He was not a man for whom wealth was entirely unfamiliar, though not at the scale a Powerball jackpot produces. He made substantial donations after his win, including to local churches and charitable causes, and the record of those gifts is real and documented alongside everything else that is documented about the years that followed. What followed included thefts. Large amounts of cash were taken from his car on more than one occasion, and legal disputes, and the death of his granddaughter, Brandy, and later the death of his daughter. These are the facts. They are stated here at the same level and in the same register as the jackpot amount and the lump sum figure, because they belong to the same story, and the story is neither a caution nor a celebration. It is simply what happened to one man after one number came up on one December evening in West Virginia. Whitaker himself said, in interviews years after the win, that he wished he had torn the ticket up. That statement belongs to him and to the particular weight of what he had experienced. It sits in the record alongside the $314.9 million figure, and neither cancels the other out. What the record shows is that a very large sum of money landed in one person's life, and that life was changed by it in ways that were both generous and painful and beyond what anyone planned for. The lottery had done what lotteries do. It had produced a result. The people who keep playing the same numbers for years, for a decade, for 15 years, for long enough that the specific arrangement of 6 digits becomes a kind of private habit, do not think of themselves, most of them, as engaged in anything more formal than hope. Academic research published in the Journal of Gambling Studies in 2014 found that between 15 and 25% of consistent lottery players maintain the same number selections across years or even decades, driven by an emotional attachment to numbers that carry personal meaning. Birthdays, anniversaries, the age at which something important happened, the street number of a house they once lived in. The numbers are not chosen for their mathematical properties. They are chosen because they belong to something. The UK National Lottery has documented multiple cases of players who won significant prizes after 15 or more years of playing identical numbers. These cases exist in the records, not as anomalies, but as expected outcomes, the direct result of persistence applied to a probability space, where persistence, given enough time and a running game, eventually encounters a match. The player who has filled in the same grid every week for 15 years has made that grid more than a lottery entry. It has become a ritual, and the ritual has its own texture and weight, regardless of the result. The pen moves across the familiar squares from memory. The numbers arrive in the same order every time. The slip crosses the counter and enters a process larger than the person who initiated it, and then the week passes, and the pen comes out again. There is a woman, hypothetical in her particulars, but real in everything the research describes, who sits at a kitchen table somewhere in England on a Saturday afternoon and marks 6 numbers that she has been marking since the lottery launched in 1994. The year is now well past 2009. She has marked those numbers more than 700 times. She does not pause over the slip. She does not review her choices or reconsider them. The pen moves with the fluency of a gesture that has been performed so many times it no longer requires attention, the way a signature does, the way a habitual rote does, the way any sufficiently repeated action eventually settles into the body as a kind of knowledge that is not quite conscious. The slip slides across the counter. She takes her receipt. She does not expect in any week that is not this week to win. The expectation is long and diffuse and oriented not toward any particular draw, but toward the accumulation of draws that constitutes a life of playing. If she wins, she will have won because the combination she chose 17 years ago happened to match the combination that a machine produced on a specific evening in front of a camera. The emotional weight of that matching will be enormous. The mathematical structure of it is simple. 2 sets of 6 numbers, identical. The 17 years will feel like the reason. The mathematics will hold that 17 years as a quantity of trials rather than a quantity of meaning. Both things will be true. Neither will be more true than the other. Joan Ginther's store in Bishop had a particular smell, the way all small stores in small Texas towns have a particular smell, the faint petroleum undertone of the asphalt just outside, the cool air from the refrigerator case along the back wall, the metallic faint of the lottery display rack near the register. She would have known the smell. She had been there before. The 4th ticket was not her first visit to that rack, or to racks like it across the area around Bishop, and the act of selecting it was performed against the background of a long history of similar acts, some of which had resulted in extraordinary outcomes, and most of which had not. The 4th ticket was, in the end, one card drawn from a display in a room under fluorescent light in a town in South Texas on an ordinary afternoon. The stories of Stefan Mandel and Joan Ginther and Jack Whittaker and the long-term UK players occupy the same category, only loosely. They are connected by the lottery, by the particular structure of a game that takes money in and returns some portion of it to a small number of participants in unpredictable quantities. But the relationship each person had with that game was entirely different in kind. Mandel treated the lottery as an engineering problem. Ginther's relationship remains undetermined. Whittaker encountered the lottery on a single occasion and was transformed by it in ways he did not invite. The UK player encounters the lottery every week, patiently and without drama, as a feature of her weekly routine. The game is the same for all of them. The game met each of them differently. There is a particular calm in thinking about people who simply keep showing up. Mandel arrived with a plan. Whittaker arrived once. Ginther arrived in ways that are documented but not explained. The long-term player arrives every Saturday or every Tuesday, or whenever the draw in her jurisdiction is scheduled, and she arrives with the same slip filled out in the same way and a mild, unhurried hope that this week the columns will align. Most weeks they do not. She returns the following week. The scratch-off format that Ginther favored operates differently from a draw game, and the difference matters to anyone who thinks about it carefully. In a draw game, the winning numbers are determined at the moment of the draw, after all tickets have been sold. In a scratch-off game, the winning status of every card is established at the time of printing, before any ticket is purchased. The prize structure of a scratch-off game is therefore fixed from the beginning, a certain number of winning cards distributed within a larger print run, each box of cards containing a known ratio of winners to non-winners. The distribution pattern determined by the lottery's operating algorithm at the time of production. This does not mean a scratch-off game is predictable in the ordinary sense. The location of winning cards within the print run is not published. Individual cards are not labeled with their outcomes, but the statistical architecture of the game exists, and it exists before any hand reaches toward the display rack. Whether Ginther's understanding of that architecture contributed to her 4 wins is not established. It is a thing that has been proposed, examined, and left unresolved, the way a door is left open when the person who passed through it did not stop to pull it shut. The Texas Lottery Commission reviewed her wins. No mechanism for gaming the system was identified. No allegation of fraud was made. The 4 wins stand in the record as 4 wins, and the record does not go further than the record goes. Stefan Mandel went further, in the documentary sense, than perhaps anyone else in the history of lottery gaming. His 14 wins across Romania, Australia, and the United States are each documented through the operational structures of the syndicates he ran, the investment pools he organized, the printing and sorting operations he oversaw. The paper trail of his Virginia operation alone would fill more than the warehouse where the tickets were sorted. He understood, in a way that lottery designers had perhaps not fully considered when they set the rules, that a lottery game with a finite number of combinations is not, strictly speaking, a game of chance for a participant with sufficient capital and coordination. It is a calculation. The chance is in the question of whether the jackpot will outweigh the cost. The covering of combinations is arithmetic. Lottery authorities in multiple countries arrived at the same conclusion and changed their rules, each in their own way. The Virginia change was among the most comprehensive in the United States, specifically addressing bulk purchase operations of the kind Mandel had used. Other jurisdictions followed. The effect was to restore the lottery to its intended function, a game whose expected value favors the lottery over any individual participant, regardless of how many tickets that participant purchases, because the cost of full coverage will eventually be set above the value of any available prize. The mathematics that Mandel had found useful was not destroyed. It was simply moved to a domain where it could no longer be applied profitably. He went to Vanuatu. The algorithm stayed behind in the files of the jurisdictions that had, in their various ways, learned from it. There is a kind of story that arrives quietly and builds its strangeness slowly, without announcement. Joan Ginther's story is that kind. The first win in 1993 was enormous but not unique. Major lottery wins happen regularly, and a $5.4 million prize is documented and noted and then absorbed into the record. The second win in 2006 is where the record begins to resist easy absorption. A person winning 2 major lottery prizes, separated by 13 years, is statistically unusual but not impossible. The third win moves the distribution of outcomes further into the improbable end of the range. The fourth win, the $10 million scratch-off from the store in Bishop in 2010, places the full sequence somewhere that probability theory can accommodate, but human intuition cannot easily hold. Some analyses have estimated the probability of winning 4 such prizes as approximately 1 in 18 septillion, a number so large it is nearly meaningless as a way of expressing improbability, because a number that size has no intuitive referent. Others have pointed out that the calculation depends entirely on the assumptions built into it, whether all tickets are bought randomly, whether the ticket buyer has any means of selecting cards with higher win probabilities, whether the wins are drawn from a pool of all Texas lottery players, or specifically from Ginther's documented purchasing history. Change the assumptions, and the number changes. The range of possible calculations is wide. The range of documented facts is not. 4 wins, 1 person, 1 store in a small town, no fraud found. Jack Whittaker's story is different in nearly every dimension. He did not study lotteries. He did not develop algorithms. He did not select numbers on the basis of any system. He purchased a Powerball ticket, and on December 25th, 2002, that ticket matched the jackpot numbers, and the machine that processes such things registered the match. And from that point forward, his life was what it was. The scale of the prize, $314.9 million, the largest ever won by a single ticket at that time, arrived in his hands and did what very large and unexpected things tend to do to the structures that receive them. It changed the pressures, not all in predictable directions. The charitable donations he made were genuine and substantial. He gave a tithe of 10% of the winnings to Christian organizations, established a charitable foundation, and donated money to several local causes in West Virginia. These gifts existed alongside and before the difficulties that followed. Both sets of facts belong to the same record, held together without contradiction, because one person can be generous and also overwhelmed, and a very large prize can produce both of those conditions in the same life. The long-term player who marks the same 6 numbers every week has a relationship with the lottery that is in some ways more intimate than Whittaker's single encounter, and in some ways less complicated. She knows the game. She has watched it for years. She has filled in thousands of slips and received thousands of non-matching results and returned to fill in thousands more. And the practice has become something that is less about winning in any given week and more about the continuation of a habit that has its own meaning inside the structure of her week. The results accumulate without consequence. Mostly, the habit continues. The UK National Lottery has been running since November 1994. A player who started that month and has played every draw since has participated in more than 3,000 draws by the time enough years have passed to matter in this context. 3,000 draws of the same 6 numbers. The probability that any single draw produces those 6 numbers is, for a standard 6/49ths game, approximately 1 in 13.98 million. Across 3,000 draws, the probability of a win remains low in absolute terms, roughly 1 in 4,000, still a number that most people would not describe as good odds. But it is a very different number from 1 in 13.98 million. Persistence compresses the odds. Not dramatically, not enough to make the game a good investment in any conventional sense, but enough to make the mathematics of long-term play different from the mathematics of a single ticket. The emotional experience of filling in the same numbers for 3,000 weeks is not something the mathematics accounts for. The mathematics sees 3,000 independent trials. The player sees 3,000 returns to something she knows, and the knowing, the recognition of the numbers as hers, as carrying her history, is a thing that exists outside the probability space entirely. It is not irrational, exactly. It is simply a different kind of knowing, organized around attachment rather than calculation. Mandel's knowing was organized entirely around calculation, and the calculation was extraordinarily precise. Before the Virginia operation, he spent years refining the algorithm that allowed him to determine the minimum number of ticket combinations needed to guarantee a win in lotteries with specific number pools. The condensation method he developed is a real mathematical structure related to what combinatorics calls covering designs, configurations of subsets that collectively cover all possible combinations within a larger set. He did not invent covering designs. He applied them to a specific practical problem with specific financial stakes, and the application worked 14 times. The gap between 14 wins through systematic coverage and 4 wins through undetermined means is wide, and it is interesting. Mandel's wins are explained in their structure, even if the execution was remarkable. Ginther's wins resist that kind of explanation, because scratch-off games have a different and more complicated structure than draw games, and because whatever approach she may have used, if she used any approach, has not been documented or confirmed. The two stories sit side by side in the record of remarkable lottery outcomes, offering different shapes of the same broad fact that some people have won major lottery prizes at rates far exceeding what a simple model of random chance would predict, and that the explanations available vary considerably in their completeness. A shelf somewhere in the archives of the Texas Lottery Commission holds the records of Joan Ginther's 4 wins. The documents are probably not remarkable to look at. The standard forms and verification records and prize claim paperwork that any major win generates, filed in the order they were received, the columns of numbers and dates, and prize amounts laid out in the bureaucratic format that official records use. 4 rows, roughly, representing 4 events spread across 17 years. The paperwork is complete. The investigation that followed the 4th win found nothing irregular. The shelf holds the records the way any shelf holds records, without comment. A shelf in a Melbourne office, or perhaps no longer anywhere that is easily located, once held the records of Stefan Mandel's Australian syndicate operations, the investment agreements, the ticket printing orders, the prize claim documentation, the accounting of costs against returns. He won 14 times. The records of each win followed the structure of the operation, documented, reviewed, found to be in compliance with the rules of the relevant jurisdiction at the time, and then absorbed into the permanent record of lotteries that had been won by parties whose methods were not anticipated when the rules were written. Jack Whittaker's Powerball ticket, the physical card, if it still exists, is somewhere that is not publicly known. After the win was verified and the prize claimed, the ticket became a document in a legal and financial process, and then the process concluded and life continued. The ticket itself is perhaps the most ordinary object in the whole story, a small printed card, the kind available at thousands of gas stations and convenience stores, marked with numbers that happen to match the ones produced on one particular Christmas evening. The card has no appearance of significance. It has no special weight or texture. It is made of the same material as every losing ticket purchased that week, which is to say the same material as the vast majority of all tickets purchased in any week in any jurisdiction. The woman at her kitchen table in England on a Saturday in a year that has passed while this narration has been running marks her 6 numbers from memory. The pen moves without hesitation from the first box to the last. The slip is filled, and she sets down the pen, and the slip waits on the table while she gathers her bag and her keys and the other small items that a brief errand requires. The store is not far. She goes most Saturdays. The habit has its own geography, the particular route, the particular counter, the particular clerk who has seen her enough times to need no explanation of what she wants. The slip crosses the counter. The receipt comes back. She folds it and puts it away. The numbers on that slip have been arranged in the same pattern since the first year she played. Some of them are birthdays. Some of them are simply numbers she chose on a day she no longer remembers and has never changed, because there has been no reason to change them, and some reasons, private and accumulated, to keep them. The slip she fills in today looks exactly like the slip she filled in 15 years ago, except for the date printed at the top. The numbers are identical. She is not the same age she was then, and the pen she uses may not be the same pen, and the kitchen table may have been replaced, but the grid and the numbers and the motion of filling them in have not changed at all. The persistence of a small private ritual across 15 years is its own kind of record, distinct from and parallel to the records held in Lottery Commission archives and regulatory files and the published histories of remarkable wins. It is not measured or documented the way those records are. It accumulates in memory and in habit, in the slight groove worn into a weekly routine, in the automatic motion of a hand that has made this particular gesture more than 700 times. Most of the 700 slips produced nothing. A few may have won small prizes, 3 matching numbers, 4 matching numbers, amounts that covered the cost of the ticket and perhaps a little more. One, in a year that is not this year, but may yet come, may match all 6. The lottery in its modern form is a machine for producing improbable outcomes at scale. Not improbable in the way that fraud is improbable, or improbable in the way that miracles are claimed to be, but improbable in the plain mathematical sense that any particular ticket in any particular draw has a very small chance of matching the result. Across millions of tickets and hundreds of draws and decades of operation, the improbable becomes the routine. People win. Some people win more than once. One person won 4 times from a store in a small town in South Texas, and no one has fully explained it. One person won once, on Christmas Day, a prize so large that it changed the shape of everything that followed. One person developed an algorithm, ran syndicates across 3 continents, and won 14 times before the rules were changed to make it impossible. And somewhere on a Saturday afternoon, a player marks 6 numbers she has been marking since 1994, and slides the slip across a counter and goes home. The pen rests on the kitchen table, the receipt is folded and put away. The same 6 numbers are already waiting for next week, exactly where they have always been, patient inside the memory of a hand that knows them without needing to think. In a quiet office building in Urbandale, Iowa, sometime after the rest of the staff had gone home for the evening, a man sat at a computer terminal and moved a cursor across a screen. The room around him was the kind of room that exists in every institutional building: fluorescent lighting, a low ceiling, the faint hum of servers behind a panel to one side, the smell of recycled air and old carpet. The desk was ordinary, the chair was ordinary, the screen cast the same pale light it cast every other night. What the man installed on that machine, in the unhurried way of someone performing a routine task in a place where no one was watching, would take investigators years to fully understand. Eddie Tipton was the Information Security Director for the Multi-State Lottery Association. The title was precise and accurate. He was responsible for the systems that were meant to keep lottery draws secure, which meant he understood those systems more completely than almost anyone else in the organization. The program he placed on the random number generator computers that night was small, self-contained, and written to delete itself after a specific period of time. It allowed him to predict, on a narrow set of predetermined dates, which numbers the Hot Lotto game's computers would generate as winning combinations. On those dates, the draw equipment's usual monitoring and oversight were not active. The scheme ran for years before it began to unravel. A single unclaimed jackpot prize in Iowa set the process in motion, a winning ticket that no one had come forward to claim, purchased at a gas station in Des Moines, its numbers matching a draw from 2010. The ticket had a sell-by date on its claim. As that date approached, a representative appeared at lottery offices with a shell corporation's name attached to a claim for the prize money. Investigators, alerted by the unusual circumstances, began to look more carefully. What they found over the following months and years was a pattern that extended across Iowa, Colorado, Wisconsin, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The total value of fraudulent claims linked to Tipton's program was approximately $24 million. He was convicted in 2015 and pleaded guilty in Iowa in 2017, receiving a sentence of 25 years. The case was documented at each stage with the same methodical attention that characterizes any long investigation. Witness accounts, computer logs, surveillance footage from the gas station where the winning ticket was purchased, financial records tracing the shell, corporations, technical analysis of the self-deleting code itself. When the case closed, the record of it was thorough and complete. What came after the conviction, though, was something the lottery authorities treated with equal seriousness. Not the punishment of one man, but the question of how the system should be changed so that the same approach could not be repeated by someone else. The Multi-State Lottery Association responded to the Tipton case by requiring physical network isolation for all computers involved in draw-related functions. USB ports on those machines were disabled and sealed. Any software installation required a formal audit trail. ET personnel, including those at Tipton's own level of authority, were prohibited from entering draw equipment rooms under new protocols that required multiple authorized individuals to be present simultaneously. The access logs for those rooms became a separate, independent record. The changes were procedural rather than dramatic, the kind of incremental institutional response that does not make for a compelling headline, but that constitutes in aggregate a meaningfully different system than the one that existed before. More than 3 decades before Tipton's conviction, in a Pennsylvania lottery draw room on the afternoon of April 24, 1980, a different kind of scheme was already in progress. Nick Perry was the announcer for the daily number game. His role in the draw was public-facing and visible. He was the person whose voice accompanied the results as they were broadcast, the familiar presence whose delivery gave the event its air of transparent routine. Behind that routine, Perry and a small group of co-conspirators had spent time injecting weighted balls into the draw machine for that day's broadcast, altering the physical equipment so that only balls bearing the digits 4 and 6 could be selected. Before the draw, the group had purchased tickets covering every possible combination of those 2 digits. The draw produced the number 666. The tickets held by Perry's group were among the winners. What the conspirators had not accounted for was the visibility of a sudden and significant anomaly in the pattern of winning claims. An unusually large number of tickets bearing combinations of 4s and 6s appeared at lottery offices across Pennsylvania that day, a concentration that had no statistical explanation under ordinary conditions. Investigators were called. The weighted balls were identified and examined. The evidence was, as the subsequent record described it, patient and physical. The altered balls themselves, the financial trail of the ticket purchases, the records of the broadcast. Perry was ultimately sentenced to 7 years in prison. The draw was declared void. What the Pennsylvania case demonstrated, among other things, was that physical lottery equipment is not immune to interference, and that the consequences of interference tend to produce anomalies that careful record-keeping can detect. The weighted balls left a trace, not in the machine itself, but in the pattern of results. The statistical footprint of a constrained draw was visible in the claims that followed it. The investigators did not need to prove the mechanism before they had reason to look. The record of outcomes, held against the record of ordinary probability, was enough to indicate that something in the draw had not functioned as expected. Between the Pennsylvania case and the Iowa case, 2 decades of lottery fraud investigations in North America, Europe, and Australia produced a steady refinement in the oversight structures surrounding lottery draws. Each incident was reviewed not only as an isolated act requiring a legal response, but as a case study in the specific gap in institutional design that had made the act possible. The changes that followed each case were, in most instances, modest and targeted. A new verification step here, a revised access protocol there, a requirement for independent auditing that had previously been optional. The overall effect accumulated across those decades was a set of systems considerably more layered than what had existed at the beginning. In Canada, a 2006 investigation by a television program documented a pattern that did not involve draw machines or number generators at all. The vulnerability was elsewhere in the system, at the point where a lottery player hands a ticket to a retailer for scanning. What the investigation found was that some lottery retail workers had been scanning customers' tickets and telling those customers, falsely, that their tickets had not won. The retailer then kept the ticket and claimed the prize. The scheme worked because the customer had no independent way to verify the scan result. The scanner faced the retailer, not the customer. The fix, once the problem was clearly identified, was a piece of hardware, a customer-facing display added to lottery terminals, showing the scan result directly to the player on a small screen angled outward toward them. The reform was adopted in British Columbia, Quebec, and several American states, and the physical simplicity of the solution, a screen that faces outward rather than inward, made visible what had made the fraud possible in the first place. The Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation case produced no dramatic confrontation and no single perpetrator whose story resolved cleanly at trial. What it produced instead was a statistical record. Lottery retail workers were winning major prizes at a rate that fell well outside what probability predicted for a population of that size. The investigation that followed was thorough and patient, and what it documented was not a single conspiracy, but a dispersed pattern of individual acts made possible by the same structural gap. The reforms it prompted were similarly dispersed and structural, procedural changes distributed across the system at the specific points where the gap had been. All of these cases, Pennsylvania in 1980, Ontario in 2006, Iowa across the years between 2010 and 2017, share a common shape when viewed from a certain distance. Each involved a person or small group who understood a specific aspect of the lottery system more thoroughly than the oversight structures surrounding it, and who used that understanding to extract a predictable outcome from a process designed to be unpredictable. Each was eventually detected, not because the perpetrators made obvious errors, but because the systems of record-keeping and statistical monitoring that lottery operations maintain as a matter of routine produced data that was inconsistent with chance. The records themselves, the draws, the claims, the volumes of winning tickets in particular combinations were what generated the first questions. That quality of self-documenting continuity is one of the more quietly interesting features of a lottery operation. Every draw is recorded, every claim is filed, every piece of equipment used in a draw is logged and tracked. The cumulative record of a lottery operating for decades is an archive of considerable depth, not in the sense of a well-preserved library, but in the sense of a system that has been continuously generating and retaining data about itself for long enough that anomalies, when they appear, have a great deal of normal background to be compared against. The modern infrastructure supporting that record is more deliberate and layered than it was in the era of Nick Perry and the weighted balls. Lottery draw machines now operate under tamper-evident seals that are checked by independent auditors before each draw, and whose condition is logged. Access to draw equipment rooms requires two authorized individuals present simultaneously. A dual control system designed so that no single person, regardless of their position or technical knowledge, can be alone with the equipment before or during a draw. Multiple cameras record the draw from different angles, and the footage is retained as part of the official record. For draws that use digitally generated random numbers rather than physical balls, post-draw cryptographic verification processes confirm that the numbers produced match what the certified audited algorithm was expected to produce. Quarterly audits of lottery operations are a legal requirement in most jurisdictions. The firms that conduct them maintain their own records separately from those of the lottery operator, and the results of each audit are filed with state or national gaming regulatory authorities. In many jurisdictions, those reports are available for public inspection. The filing creates a parallel, independent record that sits alongside the lottery's own documentation, two accounts of the same events, produced by separate parties with different interests, which must agree with each other in all material particulars. The auditor conducting one of those quarterly reviews sits, typically in an ordinary office, with ordinary furniture, a desk, a good lamp, a set of documents spread across the workspace in a particular order that reflects the structure of the review process. The work is methodical. Each section of the report covers a specific aspect of the operation: equipment condition, access logs, draw records, claims processing, statistical analysis of outcomes. The person doing the work has done it many times before, knows the sequence of steps, moves through the documents at the pace of careful attention. The report that results from the process is not a dramatic document. It is a record of whether things are as they should be, and in the great majority of cases they are. The contrast between that quiet administrative work and the events that prompted the protocols surrounding it is one worth holding in mind for a moment. The weighted balls in the Pennsylvania draw machine and the self-deleting code on the Iowa server were both acts of deliberate ingenuity, specific technical knowledge applied toward a specific outcome, carried out in the expectation that the existing oversight would not be sufficient to detect them. The systems that now surround lottery draws are, in a certain sense, a response to exactly that kind of ingenuity, not a denial that it exists, but a set of structural conditions designed to make it considerably harder to apply undetected. None of those structures is designed around the assumption that the people operating within them are dishonest. They are designed around the assumption that a system robust enough to be trusted does not depend on the particular honesty of any individual within it. The dual control key that requires two people to be present, the camera that records from multiple angles, the seal that shows visible evidence of tampering, these are not accusations. They are the conditions under which the system's integrity does not rest on any single point of trust that a single bad actor could exploit. The post office has a version of this logic. So does the pharmaceutical supply chain, and the chain of custody for legal evidence, and the preparation and delivery of classified documents. In each case, the structure is built around the knowledge that the people working within it are, in the main, doing their jobs as intended, and also around the knowledge that a system that assumes this without verification is less trustworthy than one that confirms it at regular intervals. Lottery oversight is one more instance of a broad class of institutional design, no stranger than the others, and in some respects more visible than most, because the operations it covers are broadcast on television and reported in newspapers, and discussed over coffee when the jackpots grow large enough to attract public attention. There is a certain kind of institutional patience in all of this that is easy to overlook. The Pennsylvania fraud happened in 1980. The reforms it prompted were modest and specific. The Ontario fraud happened in 2006, more than 2 decades later, and involved a completely different vulnerability in a completely different part of the system. The Iowa fraud spanned the years between 2010 and 2017 and involved yet another mechanism that previous reforms had not been designed to address. Each time, the response was the same in its essential shape: patient, specific, technical, institutional, not dramatic, not comprehensive, just targeted at the particular gap that had been identified, in the knowledge that no single reform closes all possible gaps, and that the work of maintaining the integrity of a large complex system is ongoing rather than finite. That ongoing quality is perhaps the most accurate way to understand what lottery oversight actually is. It is not a finished project. It is not a guarantee. It is a set of practices and structures that are updated in response to what is learned over time about where the vulnerabilities are and how they have been exploited. The record of that learning is filed year after year in quarterly audit reports and investigation summaries and regulatory correspondence that accumulates in offices across dozens of jurisdictions simultaneously. In the Iowa case, the self-deleting program that Tipton installed was designed, among other things, to be invisible in the computer's own records. It was meant to leave no trace of its presence after it had done what it was installed to do. What it could not delete was the external record, the pattern of claims, the gas station footage, the Shell Corporation filings, the statistical anomaly of jackpots being claimed on precisely the dates when monitoring was inactive. The program erased itself. The surrounding record of the world in which it operated did not erase. That asymmetry between what a person can control inside a machine and what a machine cannot control about the world surrounding it is one of the quieter features of a well-designed oversight system. The reforms that followed Tipton's conviction were specifically designed to reduce that gap further by requiring physical isolation of draw computers from any external network, by sealing USB ports and auditing software installations, by prohibiting IT personnel from unsupervised access to draw rooms. The Multi-State Lottery Association was addressing the specific technical conditions under which Tipton's program had been installed and operated. A person with his knowledge and authority, working within the new protocols, would find the equivalent action considerably harder to execute, without detection, not impossible, perhaps, but harder in ways that make undetected execution over an extended period substantially less likely. The pattern across all of these cases, Pennsylvania, Ontario, Iowa, is that fraud of this kind does not persist indefinitely. It produces records. Those records are compared against expected patterns. The comparison, when it is done carefully by people paying attention, generates questions. The questions, when they are followed, lead somewhere. The process is slow and not always tidy, and the perpetrators sometimes benefit from their schemes for longer than they should have. But the record does not go away. The data is retained. The comparison can always be made. What the history of lottery fraud actually shows, viewed as a complete record rather than as a sequence of individual scandals, is that the same property of lottery systems that makes repeat draws interesting to statisticians, the fact that every draw is documented and retained and can be compared against every other, is also the property that makes lottery fraud in the long run detectable. There is something almost restful in that observation. Once it settles, not reassuring in a naive sense, as if detection were instant or certain, but restful in the sense that the underlying structure of the thing is sound in a particular way. The record exists, it accumulates, it is preserved. The people responsible for reviewing it are required by law to do so on a regular schedule and to file their conclusions in a place where they can be found. That is not nothing. Falling in the long geography of human systems for trying to ensure that large public probabilistic operations work as they are supposed to work, that is actually quite a lot. The Pennsylvania Draw Room on the morning after April 24th, 1980, contained a table on which the weighted balls had been laid out in a row, each one labeled. The room itself was ordinary, the same draw room that had existed before the scheme, the same equipment, the same institutional surroundings. The balls on the table were different only in a slight excess of weight, detectable by a careful hand or a precise scale. The evidence of the fraud was physical and legible and patient. It was not dramatic. It simply existed, laid out in sequence, available to be examined by the people whose job it was to examine it. The Ontario Lottery Terminal, with its new customer-facing display, is also ordinary. A small screen, angled outward, showing the scan result to the person who purchased the ticket. The technology is not sophisticated. The principle it embodies, that the person whose ticket is being scanned should be able to see the result, is not complicated. The reform is visible and simple and entirely undramatic, and it closed a specific door that had been open without fanfare in lottery retail operations for years. The Tipton server room in Urbandale, after the investigation closed and the reforms were implemented, contains machines whose USB ports are now sealed with tamper-evident inserts. The access log for the room runs on a separate system. The door opens only when two authorized key holders are present simultaneously. The machines inside do what they were designed to do, in a room that is now more thoroughly attended to than the one in which a single person once sat alone at a terminal after everyone else had gone home. None of these images are particularly striking. A table with labeled balls, a screen facing outward on a lottery terminal, a door that requires two keys. They are the physical forms taken by institutional responses to things that happened, decisions made in committee rooms and regulatory offices by people who read the investigation reports and then asked methodically what change would reduce the likelihood of the same thing happening again. The decisions were documented, the documentation was filed, the changes were made. The record of why they were made was preserved alongside the record of the events that preceded them, so that future investigators, reviewing the same archive, would be able to trace the shape of the reasoning from problem to response. That traceability is itself a kind of safeguard. A system whose design changes are documented alongside the incidents that prompted them is a system whose history of vulnerabilities is preserved rather than erased. The shelf in a state gaming regulatory office that holds decades of quarterly audit reports holds in its accumulated length a record not only of what was found to be in order, but also of what, at various points in the past, was found to require attention. The binder from 1998 and the binder from 2007 and the binder from 2018 are different documents. They reflect different operational conditions, different equipment, different protocols, but they are filed in the same place, in the same sequence, available to be compared, side by anyone with access to the archive and reason to look. The quiet that surrounds that shelf, the late evening quiet of an office where the work for the day is finished, and the documents are in their place, and the lights have been dimmed to the level kept on through the night, is the quiet of something that is simply continuing, not resolved in the sense of being finished, not troubled in the sense of requiring urgent attention, simply present. The work that produced those documents was careful and specific and will be repeated in its essential shape next quarter and the quarter after that. The people who do it are not remarkable for doing it. The process is routine. The record it produces is ordinary. The shelf grows longer by one binder each year, and the room holds all of them with the same indifference, the same level temperature, the same soft hum of the building's ventilation system, moving air through ducts that have been doing the same thing since the building was constructed. The broader landscape of lottery oversight across dozens of jurisdictions is similarly unremarkable in its aggregate effect. The auditors in Iowa file their reports. The auditors in Ontario file theirs. The regulatory offices in New South Wales and in the Czech Republic and in the United Kingdom maintain their own archives. The equipment certifiers who inspect draw machines before each use complete their inspection logs and retain copies.